Cooking under the knife, ACC spring cleaning, and pro prospects seasoning in preparation for the NFL draft. This is ACC Breakdown. We come your way, of course. It's Wednesday night. It's 8 o'clock on the East Coast, and we bring in Mike McDaniel from inside the ACC so you can catch us each and every week once this is recorded. They're on Inside the ACC, and we bring in Dan Rubin from BC Interruption to help us through a little spring football and some fun first, gentlemen. We all witnessed one of the more historic NCAA men's championship games on Monday night. Villanova getting the job done late against North Carolina with an incredible shot at the buzzer after the North Carolina shot to tie the game. So, segue to football. Let's look at since North Carolina, being in the ACC, loses an excruciatingly difficult championship game. Dan, we're going to start with you. So think through ACC history. Of course, for Boston College, near and dear to your heart, but go through the entire litany of ACC football history and think of the big national stage when an ACC team could have maybe won a championship, won a big bowl game, whatever was on the line. What are you going to liken this to the North Carolina situation on Monday night?
Any single one of the wide whatevers down at Florida State. Wide right 1, wide right 2, wide right 3, wide left, wide right 4. I don't know what they put in the water down in Florida, but for whatever what it is, Florida State just couldn't. But for all their kicking, they've had great kickers. They had some problems putting it through the uprights and beating Miami back in those days. And it's not just that they had trouble beating them. It was something over like a 10-year span, 12-year span, that half the time that they were playing Miami, half those times that they played Miami, it relied on a kicker, and they could never get the kick in. So if we're going to talk about crushing 91, 92, 2000, I think what was the third one? The last one was 04. I know I just made FSU Twitter really angry at me for bringing these up.
And this is the infamy of that series of kicks. I just looked it up, and on Wikipedia, there is a wide right page on Wikipedia with the history going through the number of games. The one I remember in particular, the one that started it off, is Florida State, a 10-0 team, loses to Miami 17-16, number 1 versus number 2, and then it ensued from there. I don't know that we're going to see a dynasty in college football consistent as Florida State was during that time. I don't remember the number of years, but it was a long string of years in double digits where Florida State finished in the top 4 in the country, something like 13 straight years. It was unbelievable, but could not get that national championship because of these issues with Miami kicking the football, and they finally broke through and won a national championship, ironically, the year that they lost in South Bend against Notre Dame, and Nebraska missed a long kick at the gun in the Orange Bowl that would have defeated Florida State, but the Seminoles finally got a little bit of luck on their side to win the national championship. Incredible stuff.
Hey, the thing I remember about that was that Notre Dame beat Florida State in that game of the century, the number 1 versus number 2 game, and then the next week, when they had number 1 high above the Golden Dome, and they had it hanging there, my man Glenn Foley with the best game I've ever seen, and David Gordon, where if you go back and look over his stats, probably I think kicked 1 field goal of 40 yards or longer in his entire career, and it was that one, the left-footed kicker. And I'll never forget him jumping up as I want to say it was not Paul Zugoskis, number 66, whatever his name was, running into the Notre Dame end zone, taking off his helmet. It was single-handedly, I was listening to it on the radio because I wasn't at home and the TV antenna wasn't working. 1993 was a great year.
Yeah, and if I remember that correctly, Boston College won that game in South Bend 40-39.
41-39. Kevin McDougal playing quarterback for the Irish, Glenn Foley, Pete Mitchell, Mike Mamula, Stephen Boyd. I think of the guys that were in that game. I think Mark Edwards might not have been playing in that. But the guys who played in that game, it was awesome. The best part about that game for me, in retrospect, and then I'll stop bragging about my one Boston College victory that I have that doesn't require me looking at Mike and giggling, is the is the infamous it was either the next year we had T-shirts at BC that said Lou who, and then on the back it said Lou and exactly what people thought of Lou Holtz out here in Massachusetts. So good times back then.
When it comes to ACC football and trying to liken a football situation to the despair that North Carolina suffered on Monday night in basketball, it's difficult to top this series of games that Florida State lost to Miami. Here is wide right 2 as a 1916 game, number 2 versus number 3 in the country. Florida State at 4-0 at that point, playing earlier in the season, and it just continued from there. Again, Florida State excruciating losses to Miami during that time with everything on the line each and every time. All right, Mike, North Carolina loses on a buzzer beater for the national championship game in basketball on Monday night. Can you liken it to anything that you've experienced in terms of an ACC football loss on the big stage?
Well, Dan got his punch in there with BC over Notre Dame. My family, just gigantic Notre Dame fans. I was a year old in '93, so I'm not going to attest to remembering it at all. But my family still talks about to this day how heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching that was after the win the week prior against Florida State. I guess if I had to pick a more recent example of a team losing at the buzzer when they probably shouldn't, 2012 Sugar Bowl, Virginia Tech against Michigan. Yes, Virginia Tech fans still complained about the Danny Cole catch in the end zone at overtime. It was a catch. I'm on board with that. But Tech had numerous attempts to put that game away earlier on. Throughout most of the second half, they were moving the ball up and down the field, just made a bunch of stupid mistakes, penalties, turnovers. They had a backup kicker in that game who ended up missing what would have put Tech ahead in overtime. It would have been 23-20. Well, Justin Meyer lined up after Danny Cole. The Danny Cole catch was overturned, lined up for a field goal, missed it. And, of course, Michigan converted on the field goal to escape with a 23-20 victory in the Sugar Bowl. But I just remember so vividly, it was my sophomore year of college, and Virginia Tech was playing so well defensively. Bud Foster had his boys ready for Denard Robinson and company, and Junior Hemingway was actually the most outstanding player in that game for Michigan. He had a pretty big game at receiver, but for the most part, Tech was able to hold down Michigan for a better part of that game, and somehow they still were able to squander it away. And Virginia Tech, from start to finish, just looked like the much better team, and they really just could not seal the deal, and I still remember it. And looking at the North Carolina game the other night, they had numerous chances there in the second half to pull away, and then they got down by 10 with about 9 minutes to go, and they come all the way back. You just saw North Carolina kind of laboring all night. So I like to compare that to the Virginia Tech game in the 2012 Sugar Bowl.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Michigan, Virginia Tech, obviously two very successful teams that year because they were playing in the Sugar Bowl. Michigan was the 2 or 3 seed out of the Big Ten, did not win the championship in that conference. Virginia Tech, did they, in fact, win the ACC that year, Mike?
They did not. They lost to Clemson twice. They lost to them once in the regular season and then once in the ACC championship game, so Clemson won the conference that year.
Oh, so this was the Clemson team that then went to Miami to play in the Orange Bowl and gave up 70 points to Geno Smith and company.
This is the Taj Boyd, Sammy Watkins as a freshman, DeAndre Hopkins. That offense was loaded. You think Clemson's offense is loaded now? That offense back in 2012 was loaded for the Tigers.
Yeah, just to give more specific ire to your rant here, Mike, because I knew that the statistics were lopsided in the Hokies' favor. 377 total yards to Michigan's 184, held a Michigan rushing team to 56 yards on the ground and only 12 first downs.
Denard could not get going that entire game.
No, Denard Robinson, 9 of 21 for $117, 2 touchdowns and a pick. Logan Thomas, of course, tight end turned quarterback. Decent game here, 19 of 28, 214 with a pick. And, Fitz Toussaint, Michigan's leading rusher, 13 carries for 30 yards. Denard Robinson, he tore it up, of course, in the Big Ten, one of the great running quarterbacks of all time. 13 carries, 13 yards against the Hokies defense, but Virginia Tech and the officials found a way for Michigan to escape with a win.
Which is kind of ironic because Virginia Tech's defense of late has had so much trouble stopping mobile quarterbacks. And then you look back at the 2012 game, and it seemed like that was the beginning of the end for Frank Beamer and his reign at Virginia Tech, just based off of how the offense was playing at the time. Tech has not had an offense even close to as good as they did in 2012 since then. Hopefully that'll change this year with Justin Fuente. But defensively, since the 2012 Sugar Bowl, they've had a lot of trouble stopping mobile quarterbacks. Just this past season, you look at the East Carolina game, for example. Like, these are teams that Tech should beat time and time again, and they're really struggling stopping mobile quarterbacks. So Bud Foster might need to flip back to the 2012 game film, maybe find a recipe for success against these dual-threat quarterbacks.
All right, quite the stroll down memory lane, ACC football lore, in honor of North Carolina's excruciating loss in upset fashion to Villanova on Monday night for the national championship in men's basketball. But we bring it fast forward up to the spring of 2016. And Dan, we understand that footballs are flying all over the place on the BC campus at spring practice. I'd like to know how many are hitting the ground, though.
None, because of the quarterback, which is the most amazing thing. So Patrick Cole's who's going to be quarterback right now for Boston College, fifth-year start, a fifth-year transfer from Kentucky, comes up. Scott Loeffler, now the offensive coordinator at Boston College, and they've reconfigured from what we've heard about spring practice and some of the things that we've seen in the videos that have been released from Boston College. They're really going to a different style of offense. They've really decided that when they were the fifth team, they were going to change things up. They were the fifth team to open up their practice, and they were really reconfiguring their entire offense around tolls. And one of the ways to change Jeff Smith, who was one of the 4 starters from last season, and Troy Flutie, who, of course, you know, how many times can you talk about him just because of his last name? They've opted to move them out of the quarterback position. Jeff Smith was moved to a wide receiver. He had great chemistry with Tolles, had a problem with his hands, which, no shocker. Number one, because he couldn't complete a pass. Why would he be able to catch one? But he's got electric speed. They're trying him out as a running back. With the loss of Sherm Alston, I would expect to see him kind of factor in either out of some trickery, some jet sweeps, things that Scott Loeffler does love to run. He has a guy with speed that he can run. So along those lines, Mike's looking at me laughing because I'm excited about a jet sweep with a quarterback right now. And with Troy Flutie, they put him on the jugs machine and have been trying to work him out a little bit to the quarterback position. But it looks like a starter. They're going to go to a more of a pro style, up to bringing back a couple of receivers who didn't play last year because they were hurt. They've said, but the real surprise has been the fact that there's an emergence of Tommy Sweeney, who was a tight end who had good hands last year when they could get the ball to him with full times. Sweeney's going to be able to be a pass-catching tight end when Tolles is throwing it to offense, a pro-style offense, and it's the type of offense that actually touted as saying when they're recruiting, throw more than the New England Patriots. The fact Steve Adazio-led team, that's just incredible. Finally there's excitement because maybe we'll complete a pass this year. I don't know.
So, Dan, while the offense should be improved, and it can't help but be improved based on scoring 9 points, even with those explosions against FCS competition early in the season, it still only scored 9 points per game, countered by the 60 points early against Howard. My question is the defense going to be nearly as good as it was in 2015? But maybe the offense gets much better, but if the defense isn't nearly as good, then you're looking at 0 or 1 wins against in the conference again.
I don't necessarily think when we look at them, their defense is absolutely going to take a step back. I don't necessarily think that it's going to be that far back. I think it's to keep up the breakneck pace that they had. When you figure that they were a top 5 defense, they were the best defense in college football. They had an offense that was atrocious. That was one of the worst offenses in the history of college football, and they managed to keep it going, to keep teams score low. They managed to keep the point totals low, and in doing that, they really established themselves as one of the best, if not the best, defenses in college football. Now, what that means is that it's going to transition. They have a new defensive coordinator with Don Brown out at Michigan. They bring in Jim Reed, and the aggressiveness and kind of along those lines, it's imperative to keep that up, but there are parts that they have to replace on the defensive line and in the secondary. Replacing 3 or 4 pieces off of a is going to be a step back. Leadership to say this defense could still be one of the best in the league, which means they're going to get a couple of wins that maybe they shouldn't. I think BC is going to be improved. I'm not just saying that as a wicked homer, but I think that they'll be improved provided what we're saying and what we're seeing in practice can.
So with a new offensive coordinator in place, a quarterback who has at least a partially winning track record there in Lexington with Patrick Tolles and John Hilleman coming back on offense, there is some hope in BC to score more than 9 points per game. All right, Mike. Mike's not necessarily thinking that's the case, but we'll let him take off on the Hokies. Any other storylines you're following, Mike?
I was just laughing because it's the state of the Boston College offense that you're really, really excited to see Scott Loeffler come to town. I mean, that's just kind of – Dana and I we've talked about this kind of at length about Loeffler, but he's a guy that, he calls when he wants to call. He just, I don't feel like he gets a lot of input from the coaching staff on what he wants to run. He just kind of goes with what he thinks is best. He's an interesting play caller, a guy that comes up with some interesting concepts, but by the same token runs some stuff in some strange situations that makes you want to bang your head against a wall time and time again. He's one of those coordinators, but he'll definitely bring some excitement to Boston College. As far as spring ball at Virginia Tech, the big story this week is the emergence of the defensive line. There were some concerns just based off of losing Corey Marshall and Luther Matty from the middle of the defensive line, and then losing a guy like Daddy Nicholas at defensive end. Really only having Kenny Canham there as far as a veteran at the defensive line. But some guys have kind of emerged there this camp. Tim Settle is a guy who was an ESPN 300 recruit, pretty highly touted coming out of high school. He's from the Northern Virginia area. He actually took a redshirt this past season, so he'll enter next season, this 2016 season, as a redshirt freshman. He's a guy that could potentially factor in. He's a big boy, though. He's sitting at 330, clogging up the middle of the line. So there's some questions about his ability to play every down, which I guess is not a huge surprise. Conditioning could be an issue, but in his mind, he's at an ideal playing weight. I mean, if it's effective for him, it's effective. He looked really good on his high school film, but again, he's going to be 2 years removed from high school, so it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how he develops and how good he actually becomes once he steps foot on the field for the first time this fall. Another guy that got a little bit of playing time in 2014, then redshirted last year after being injured, was Ricky Walker, a guy who kind of made an impact as a rotational player on the defensive line a couple of seasons ago. He's making a very good impression for Bud Foster and his staff here in camp. He's looked very good by all indications. So I think Virginia Tech's going to have a plethora of guys to choose from on the defensive line, but those are two of the younger guys that are kind of making an impact that, coming into camp, Tech was really interested to see, who would emerge from that defensive line, especially from the younger group of guys, the freshmen, the redshirt freshmen. And those are two guys that Bud Foster's excited about and he thinks can make an impact when they step on the field this fall.
And as we alluded to off the top during the tease of the show, Florida State football's announced that Dalvin Cook had right shoulder surgery on Tuesday, expected to be sidelined for several months, according to Jimbo Fisher in his news conference after Wednesday's practice. It will allow sophomore running back Jacques Patrick and junior Ryan Green to take snaps with the first team during the spring game coming up this Saturday at the Citrus Bowl in Orlando. Of course, we know all we need to know about Dalvin Cook's ability, so sometimes this turns into a blessing in disguise when other guys that have far less experience and reps are able to get those snaps with the first team. Then you bring back the stud, and he's well rested as long as he can be on the mend and get some reasonable conditioning time in August and ready to play. So several months. We're looking at early April to get us ready for the first week of September, so 5 months for Dalvin Cook to be back in play for Florida State, and a huge, huge game for the ACC and the Seminoles in particular that should gain national attention against Ole Miss on opening night. That'll be an interesting one. Guys, any thoughts about Dalvin Cook or anything else?
I was waiting. I was like, you want to talk there? As far as the Dalvin Cook injury, I think having a guy like Patrick at Florida State, first of all, Jaquez Patrick was a guy that coming into the beginning of last season, he was extremely highly touted coming out of high school, but he was a raw talent. There was kind of some question marks coming out of camp about his ability to grasp the offense. With Dalvin Cook's hamstring issues for the better part of last year, I know Dalvin Cook didn't miss a ton of time. If anything, it really just kind of limited his ability in games. I know that's kind of crazy because of the numbers he still put up with an injured hamstring. But Patrick was able to go out there and make an impact when he was summoned upon. And I think that, especially with spring practice going the way it is with Dalvin Cook now obviously being out for the better part of the summer, they're expecting him back before fall camp. At least that's the hope. I think Patrick will be able to get some valuable reps because he's going to be the guy here 2 years from now is going to replace Dalvin Cook when he inevitably makes that jump to the NFL.
All right, guys, before we say goodbye, Dan, anything throughout the rest of the ACC you'd like to hit on?
Yeah, I was doing some homework, and there's some great stuff over on State of the U. They do a good football position preview, and one of the things that I'm actually pretty excited about comes out of the University of Miami. Anybody who watched Georgia over their time under Mark Richt knows that Georgia really liked to pound the rock and really liked to run the ball, and the number of pass attempts versus the number of rush attempts, it was really a pro-style offense. One of the more interesting position battles to keep an eye on is going to be out of Miami, where they're going to change things up. And for a team that did not run the ball well at all in yards per carry or yards per game, with a bad offensive line, they're really going to have to shake things up and get things going. And the name that people are going to need to know is Gus the Bus Edwards, as they refer to him. Gus Edwards was injured 2 weeks before or was taken out 2 weeks before the season opener. Was a short yardage type back. Those are the types of running backs that will fare very well in the Mark Richt offense, and I am very excited to see what happens down at Miami with a new style offense. It might not be as exciting as I think people want. I think people sometimes want to see guys flying all over the field and rushing up and throwing it and chucking it. I know fans generally like that more because it looks better, but Miami's going to be a pound the rock type team, I think, under Richt, and Gus the Bus is going to be a name that we're all going to have to take note of out of Miami. At least that's what I'm hearing, and that's what I'm reading out on State of the U.
All right, ACC football fans, this Saturday we've got Boston College. We also have Miami, the aforementioned Florida State, North Carolina, and those seem to be the teams that are gearing up along with the Pitt Panthers for spring games this Saturday, so keep your eye out for that, for recaps and so forth, so we can dive into it again next week. All right, I think that puts a wrap on it. For Mike McDaniel from Inside the ACC, Dan Rubin from BC Interruption, this is ACC Breakdown. We will see you next Wednesday.